Story 1. Ever heard of the Blackwell Printing House? No. Well, you're in for a tale that might make you think twice before handling anything printed there. The Blackwell Printing House was founded in the late 1800s, in a small industrial town that was just starting to thrive. It was a modest operation at first, just a few printing presses, run by Henry Blackwell himself and a handful of workers. They mostly printed local newspapers, pamphlets, and a few books for nearby businesses. But Henry was ambitious. He had dreams of expanding the business, making Blackwell Printing a name that would be known far beyond the small town. Things took a turn when Henry came across a deal that seemed too good to be true. He was approached by a traveling merchant who claimed to have an old, yet powerful, printing press for sale. Now, this was no ordinary machine. It was massive, made of dark, heavy iron, with intricate carvings along its frame that looked like ancient symbols, things no one could quite decipher. The merchant was eager to sell it, and for a price far lower than it was worth. He said it had belonged to a long-defunct printing company in another city, and it had been sitting and used for years. Henry, being the businessman he was, didn't think twice. He bought it, had it transported to his factory, and set it up in the heart of the workshop. The press was unlike anything his workers had ever seen. It didn't just print pages faster than their old machines, it seemed to hum with a kind of energy, almost as if it were alive. The workers were in awe of its efficiency. Henry was thrilled. Orders started pouring in, and soon Blackwell Printing House was expanding, taking on contracts from all over the region. But strange things began happening almost as soon as that press arrived. It started small, workers reporting hearing odd noises when the machine was running, like whispers. Others said they felt like they were being watched, even when no one else was around. At first, no one paid much attention. After all, a factory like that is bound to have its share of creaks and groans, right? Then came the accidents. The first one was a young man named David Green, a new worker who'd just started at the press. He was found dead one morning, crushed beneath one of the massive iron gears of the machine. The official report said it was an accident, maybe he'd slipped while cleaning the press. But the other workers whispered that they'd heard him scream the night before. And not just a scream of pain, more like fear, as though something had dragged him into the gears. After that, things only got worse. Another worker, Mary Allen, went missing. She had been working the late shift one night, and the next morning, she was gone. No one had seen her leave, and none of her belongings were taken from the factory. The only clue was a trail of ink leading from her workstation to the printing press. The ink was thick, almost like blood, and it had a metallic smell that no one could explain. Despite a thorough search, Mary was never found. People started saying that the press had taken her, that the machine itself was hungry, feeding on the workers who got too close. Henry tried to keep the rumors at bay. He paid off the families of the victims, hired new workers, and pressed on with business as usual. But deep down, even he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that hung over the factory. Every time the press was in operation, it seemed to pulse, as though it had a life of its own. Workers reported seeing shadows moving in the corners of the room, and some said they heard the voice of Mary, or David, whispering their names when they were alone with the machine. The breaking point came when a prominent local businessman, Edward Simons, hired Blackwell Printing to produce a series of political pamphlets. These pamphlets were to be distributed all across the state, and Henry saw this as his big break, a chance to finally achieve the fame and fortune he'd always dreamed of. The press worked overtime to complete the order. Henry himself stayed late into the night, overseeing the production, even though he hated being alone with that machine. The pamphlets were delivered on time, but when they were distributed, something went terribly wrong. People who read them began to feel off. Some complained of dizziness and headaches. Others said they felt an overwhelming sense of fear or paranoia after reading just a few lines. Then the hallucinations started. People reported seeing visions of strange, twisted figures, ink-stained hands reaching out from the darkness. Some even claimed that the pamphlets themselves were changing, that the words on the page were shifting, forming messages that were never printed. Panic spread through the town. People burned the pamphlets, refusing to touch anything that had come from Blackwell Printing. Business dried up overnight, and Henry, once the town's most successful businessman, became a pariah. The final straw came when Edward Simons, the man who had commissioned the pamphlets, was found dead in his office, his body covered in black ink. His hands were clutching one of the pamphlets, and his face was frozen in a look of pure terror. After that, the authorities shut down the factory. The workers fled, refusing to ever set foot near the cursed printing press again. But Henry, he wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't. That press had become an obsession. He was convinced that it held some kind of power, something beyond this world. He began spending all his time at the factory, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. It wasn't long before Henry himself disappeared. The factory had been abandoned for weeks, but neighbors reported seeing lights flickering inside late at night. Some claimed they heard the sound of the press, grinding away in the darkness, even though no one was there to operate it. Eventually, a group of local men decided to investigate. They found the factory door wide open, the air inside thick with the smell of ink and metal. In the center of the workshop, the press stood silent, its iron gears covered in rust and dust. But on the floor, in front of the machine, they found something chilling, a set of footprints, made of ink, leading from the press to the door. They were Henry's footprints, but they abruptly ended, as if he had been swallowed up by the very floor itself. No one ever saw Henry Blackwell again. The factory was shut down for good, and the press was dismantled, its parts sold off to various buyers across the country. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. Over the years, pieces of the press turned up in other factories, and every time they did, accidents followed. Workers would go missing, strange noises would fill the air, and more than one person reported seeing the shadowy figure of a man, covered in ink, standing near the old machine. And that's the story of the haunted printing press. Some say it was cursed from the start, that the symbols carved into its frame were some kind of dark spell. Others think it's the ghost of Henry Blackwell himself, trapped forever in the machine that destroyed him. Whatever the truth is, one thing's for sure, that press was more than just a machine. It had a life of its own, and it left a trail of death and madness wherever it went. Story 2. This one's about an old photography studio, the kind of place that's been forgotten by time but hides some dark secrets. You know how some people say that photographs can capture a person's soul? Well, this story is about a camera that doesn't just capture the soul, it steals it. The place I'm talking about was called Silver Frame Studios, run by a man named Lewis Harrington. Lewis was an old-school photographer, the type who believed that photography was more than just snapping pictures. He thought it was an art form, something that could preserve a moment in time forever. The studio itself was a relic, stuck in the past, with large wooden cameras, red-tinted darkrooms, and rows upon rows of yellowing photo albums lining the shelves. Now, Lewis wasn't your average photographer. People came from all over town to have their portraits taken by him because his photos were different. They had an eerie quality to them, like the faces were too lifelike, the eyes almost followed you wherever you went. But Lewis was a perfectionist, obsessed with his craft. He'd spend hours in his studio, experimenting with different lighting, developing techniques, and using antique cameras that no one had touched in decades. One day, while rummaging through a dusty old attic in search of more props for his studio, Lewis came across something strange, an antique camera hidden away in a locked chest. The camera was massive, made of blackened brass and wood, with a large, cracked lens. The thing was heavy, almost too heavy for one man to carry. But what really struck Lewis was how cold it was to the touch. Even in the stifling heat of the attic, the metal felt like it had been sitting in a freezer for years. There were no markings on the camera, no sign of who had made it or where it had come from. But Lewis was intrigued. He took it down to his studio and began cleaning it, polishing the lens, and getting it ready to use. From that moment on, the camera became his obsession. He stopped using all his other equipment, focusing solely on this one machine. He even started turning away clients unless they were willing to be photographed by this mysterious camera. Here's where things get weird. The first person to have their portrait taken with the camera was a young woman named Emily Rogers, a local artist. She came in for a session one evening, and Lewis, excited to try out the new camera, promised her a stunning portrait. The session went on without any issues, but when Emily came back to pick up her photograph, something was off. The picture was perfect, almost too perfect. Every detail of her face was captured in stunning clarity, the light in her eyes, the way her hair fell across her shoulders. But there was something about her expression that made her uncomfortable. She didn't remember smiling like that. And her eyes, they seemed dead. There was no light in them, no spark. Lewis dismissed her concerns, saying it was just a trick of the lighting. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the photo was wrong, somehow. A few days after the portrait session, Emily began feeling sick. She couldn't explain it, just a sense of fatigue, like her energy was being drained. She stopped painting, stopped going out, and eventually, she stopped answering her phone. When friends went to check on her, they found her collapsed on the floor of her apartment, clutching the portrait Lewis had taken. Emily was alive, but she was barely conscious. It was as if her body had given up on life. Doctors couldn't explain what had happened to her. It was like she had aged overnight, her once vibrant spirit completely drained. And here's the strange part, when they looked at the portrait, they swore they saw something moving in the background. Just a flicker, like a shadow passing behind Emily's frozen figure. No one could explain it, but the portrait became the focal point of Emily's decline. And she wasn't the only one. Over the next few months, several other clients came to Silver Frame Studios to have their pictures taken with Lewis's antique camera. And every one of them experienced the same fate. They'd feel fine during the session, but afterward, they'd begin to waste away. Some would lose their energy, others would fall into deep depressions, and a few even disappeared without a trace. And in every case, their portraits would show some subtle change, like their smiles were a little too wide, or their eyes too vacant. Rumors started to spread around town. People said that the camera was cursed, that it was somehow stealing the souls of the people it photographed. Lewis, of course, denied it all. He became reclusive, only emerging from his studio for the occasional portrait session. But the townspeople grew wary, and soon, no one wanted to be photographed by him. Things reached a breaking point when a local priest, Father John, decided to confront Lewis. He'd heard the rumors and believed that the camera was indeed cursed, perhaps even possessed by some dark force. He went to Silver Frame Studios one stormy evening, determined to destroy the camera and put an end to whatever was happening. When Father John entered the studio, he found Lewis in the darkroom, developing yet another portrait. The room was filled with the smell of chemicals and the faint sound of whispering, though there was no one else there. Lewis was hunched over the photo, his hands trembling as he pulled the print from the tray. Father John demanded that Lewis hand over the camera, but Lewis refused. He was obsessed with it, convinced that it was the key to capturing the perfect image. A struggle ensued, and in the chaos, the camera was knocked to the floor. As it hit the ground, the lens shattered, and a piercing scream filled the room. But it wasn't Lewis or Father John screaming, it was coming from the camera itself. The sound was like 1,000 voices crying out in unison, echoing off the walls of the studio. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, swirling around the broken camera. Father John, terrified by what he had witnessed, grabbed Lewis and dragged him out of the studio. The two men fled into the night, leaving the camera behind. But the damage had been done. The next morning, the studio was found in ruins. The camera, now nothing more than a pile of shattered glass and twisted metal, had somehow caught fire, though there was no sign of an actual blaze. As for Lewis, he was never the same. He abandoned photography entirely, haunted by the memories of that night and the cursed camera that had nearly destroyed him. Father John, too, left the town, unable to shake the feeling that something dark still lingered in the ruins of Silver Frame Studios. And that's where the story ends, or does it? They say that some of the photographs taken by that cursed camera still exist, tucked away in forgotten albums, collecting dust in attics and basements. And if you ever come across one, be careful. Because if you look too closely, you might just see something staring back at you. Story 3. It's about an antique grandfather clock. Seems innocent enough, right? But trust me, by the end of this, you'll never look at clocks the same way again. The clock belonged to an old family, the Hamiltons, who lived in a sprawling estate on the outskirts of a small town. The Hamilton family had been around for generations, and their estate was like something out of a Gothic novel: tall, looming towers, ivy creeping up the walls, and endless halls filled with dust-covered furniture and family portraits whose eyes seemed to follow you. But the most curious thing in the whole mansion was that grandfather clock. It stood at the end of a narrow hallway, its dark wood polished to a high shine, the face gleaming, and the pendulum swinging with an almost hypnotic precision. The clock had been in the Hamilton family for centuries, passed down from one generation to the next. No one knew where it originally came from, and the oldest family records didn't mention it. It was just there. Always there. The story begins with the last heir of the Hamiltons, a man named Edward. He inherited the estate after his father passed away, and with it, the clock. Now, Edward wasn't particularly sentimental. He didn't care much for the old house or the dusty heirlooms, but he kept the clock around, mainly because it was too heavy to move. Plus, it gave the place some character. But soon after moving into the estate, Edward noticed something strange. The clock had a habit of stopping at odd times, always at 3:15 a.m., to be exact. No matter how many times he wound it or adjusted the gears, every night at 3:15, the clock would stop. It didn't just stop ticking, though. The pendulum would freeze mid-swing, and the air around the clock would turn cold, so cold that you could see your breath. At first, Edward brushed it off as some mechanical issue. After all, the clock was old. But as the days went on, he started to notice other things. The ticking of the clock would get louder at night, so loud that it echoed through the entire house. And then, there were the footsteps. Every night, at exactly 3:15 a.m., Edward would hear the sound of footsteps walking down the hall, coming closer and closer to his bedroom. But whenever he opened the door, no one was there. Just the clock, standing silently at the end of the hall. One night, curious and a little unnerved, Edward stayed awake until 3:15, determined to catch whatever, or whoever, was making the noise. As the hour approached, he sat in the dark, listening to the clock's rhythmic ticking. Then, right on cue, the ticking stopped. The pendulum froze. The air turned icy. And then, the footsteps began. They were slow, deliberate, and they seemed to be coming from right outside his door. But this time, instead of opening the door, Edward just listened. The footsteps paused in front of his room, then continued down the hall, growing fainter until they stopped at the end of the corridor, right where the clock stood. The next morning, Edward decided he'd had enough. He called in a clockmaker to examine the old relic, hoping to find some logical explanation. The clockmaker was an elderly man with a long history of working on antique timepieces, but even he seemed uneasy when he saw the grandfather clock. He examined it thoroughly, checking the gears, the pendulum, and the hands, but everything seemed to be in perfect working order. Still, he couldn't explain why it kept stopping at 3:15 a.m. That night, Edward decided to try something different. He set up a camera in the hallway, pointed directly at the clock. If there was someone, or something, moving around at night, he'd catch it on film. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the clock stopped again, the air turned cold, and the footsteps echoed down the hall. But this time, Edward didn't just hear them, he felt them. It was like someone was standing right next to him, their breath brushing against his ear. He turned on the lights, but no one was there. Shaken, he grabbed the camera and reviewed the footage. What he saw made his blood run cold. The camera had captured something, a shadow, moving through the hallway. It wasn't human. The shape was distorted, elongated, and it seemed to be dragging itself toward the clock. And as soon as it reached the clock, the footage went static. Edward didn't know what to do. He was afraid to leave the house, but he was even more afraid to stay. Over the next few days, the situation worsened. The clock began stopping more frequently, at 3:15 in the afternoon as well as the morning. The footsteps grew louder, more frantic. And the shadows started appearing in the daytime. Desperate, Edward started researching the history of the clock. He dug through old family records, looking for anything that might explain its origins. And that's when he found something disturbing, a diary belonging to his great-grandfather, Henry Hamilton. The diary was filled with strange ramblings about the clock. Henry wrote about how the clock had been brought to the estate by a man named Alexander Finch, a traveling clockmaker, over 100 years ago. But Finch wasn't an ordinary clockmaker. He was rumored to have dabbled in the occult, using his clocks to trap the souls of the dead. Henry's diary suggested that the clock wasn't just a timepiece, it was a prison for restless spirits. According to the diary, Finch had disappeared shortly after delivering the clock, and the Hamilton family had been cursed ever since. Each generation experienced strange occurrences, the footsteps, the cold spots, the shadowy figures, but none had been able to get rid of the clock. Henry had tried to destroy it once, but every time he did, the clock would reappear in its original spot, unharmed. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Edward contacted a paranormal investigator, a woman named Margaret Blackwood, who had a reputation for dealing with cursed objects. Margaret arrived at the estate with a team of experts, determined to uncover the truth about the clock. That night, they set up equipment all around the house, cameras, thermal sensors, and EVP recorders. As 3:15 a.m. approached, the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone was on edge, waiting for something to happen. And then, the clock stopped. The temperature dropped, and the footsteps began. But this time, they weren't just in the hallway, they were everywhere, echoing through the house. The team watched in horror as shadowy figures materialized in the corners of the room, their distorted shapes moving toward the clock. Margaret shouted for everyone to leave, but before they could make it to the door, the clock's face began to glow. The pendulum, which had been frozen, started swinging violently, faster and faster. And then, with a deafening crash, the glass shattered, and the room was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the clock was gone, completely disappeared. The team searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of it. The only thing left was a strange mark on the floor where the clock had stood, like a burn, etched into the wood. Edward never saw the clock again, but the estate was never the same. The shadows still lingered, and the footsteps could still be heard late at night. He eventually moved away, unable to live with the constant reminders of the cursed clock. Some say the clock is still out there, waiting to be found, waiting to trap its next victim. And if you ever come across an old grandfather clock in an antique store or an estate sale, be careful. You never know what might be lurking inside, ticking away, waiting for its moment to strike.